Bone Hunter by My Name is M. You should never underestimate the powers of a child's imagination. That's what I tell myself now, each and every day. 4 years ago, I was a devoted family man. I had a beautiful wife. She was the love of my life. We met a long time ago, at the young age of 10, and became childhood sweethearts. I remember being amazed by her from the very beginning. She was pretty, smart, kind, fun, and perfect in every way. We started dating as teenagers, and I never cared for another person as much as I did for her. A decade later, and we were happily married, much to the approval of our family and friends. My wife was incredibly hardworking, and a loving mother to our only son, Leo, who was a lot like her in many ways. Leo was both sociable and intelligent. He was always laughing and smiling, he did well in school, and played with children in our neighborhood every afternoon. Our life was pretty good, until the dreadful day when my wife passed away. She was driving home from work in the rain when a large business truck swerved straight into her car. There was a huge crash, and just like that, she was gone. The tragedy was devastating for both Leo and myself. The poor child was only 6 years old. He couldn't comprehend the situation. I did my best to hold things together. I promised Leo that I would take care of him. I told him his mother would always be watching over him, but Leo turned into a very withdrawn and unhappy young man. We became poor and had to move out of our home into a much smaller apartment. Things were difficult, but I had to stay strong for the sake of my son. Leo was an emotional wreck. His grades in school dropped, and he stopped hanging out with the other children. He even became distant from me. Every night, Leo would sit sobbing in his room, refusing to speak. I couldn't stand seeing him that way, so I saved up as much money as I could throughout the next year, and on Leo's 7th birthday, I bought him something very special. It was his very first game console, a Sega Genesis. The console was a bargain buy from a second-hand store. It came with 10 games and 2 controllers in a plastic suitcase-shaped box. When Leo opened his gift, that's when I saw it. The first genuine smile to appear upon his face in a long, long time. "Dad, thank you! Thank you!" He jumped up and down in excitement. "We have to play it! Let's play it now!" I almost cried. I had almost completely forgotten the sound of Leo's cheerful voice. I quickly set the console up on our old TV. It was a small screen, but we didn't care. "What should we play first?" I asked him. Leo pulled out a game at random, which just so happened to be a motorbike racing game, Road Rash. We grabbed a controller each and started playing. It was a very simple game, where you just drive along tracks occasionally bumping into things, but for us it was a joyous occasion. We played for hours. Leo was laughing, which made me extremely happy. I hadn't heard his laughter in such a long time. Then we moved on to another game, Bubsy, which was a platformer. If the chosen game was only designed for one player, Leo would play through a level, then pass the controller on to me, and I would play through the next. We stayed up late that night, as if it was Leo's birthday, but he had school the next day, so at 11 o'clock I sent him to bed. I stayed up an extra hour to tidy the apartment, as I had neglected it all evening to play the Sega Genesis. Once it was clean, I decided to go to bed myself. That night, I thought of my wife. I thought of how Leo smiled and laughed properly for the first time in so long, and how similar his smile was to her own. I felt so content, so at ease, and lay awake for a while to enjoy this new feeling of tranquility. I eventually closed my eyes and began to nod off, when suddenly I heard some strange music coming from the other room. It was loud but cheery, followed by some beeping and explosion noises. I instantly got to my feet and went to investigate. I walked across the small hallway to the door of the living room. At this point, I could clearly hear that the noise was coming from the TV, and most likely the Sega Genesis. I reached for the door handle, but the moment I touched it, the music and noise came to a sudden stop. I opened the door nonetheless and saw Leo kneeling on the floor with a controller close by. It was as though he had heard me coming and quickly dropped it. The TV appeared to be turned off, as did the console. "What are you doing?" I asked him. "It's time for bed." "Sorry, Dad." He looked up at me. "I wanted to play, I just found a new game." "Well, you can play it tomorrow after school," I said firmly. "Come on, you'll be tired in the morning." Leo got up and removed the game cartridge from the console and placed it back in the box with the others. I then walked him to his bedroom for the second time that night. I was glad that Leo liked his present, but things got a little out of hand from that moment on. Every day after school, he would instantly want to play the Sega Genesis. He would grab my arm and try and drag me over to the console the moment we arrived home. He became reluctant to eat and never wanted to play outside. Although he had been like this ever since his mother died, I assumed that the return in his cheery personality would make him sociable again. But no, Leo just wanted to play the Genesis all the time. I spoke to the other parents about this, and they assured me it was normal for a young boy to become addicted to video games. However, Leo's behavior gradually became more and more abnormal by the day. I would play with him for at least an hour after school, and then ask him if he wanted to do something else, perhaps play football, perhaps go see his friends, or even watch TV. He was never interested, and I had to pry him away from the console to his dinner, do his homework, and go to bed. This gradually became more and more of a challenge. One day, I picked Leo up from school as usual. During the drive home, he spoke of nothing but how we had to play the Sega Genesis together that afternoon. I was extremely tired and had a ton of paperwork to do, so I told my son that I might give tonight a miss. His reaction was astonishing. "Why can't you play with me, Dad? We always play together," he shouted stubbornly. I tried to explain the situation calmly, although I was completely taken back by Leo's sudden burst of fury. "I have a lot of paperwork to get through, Leo. I'll play with you tomorrow. Why don't you get some practice on Road Rash? So you might beat me next time?" I joked. Then Leo did something he hadn't done since the day he lost his mother. He threw a huge temper tantrum. "It's not fair, why don't you want to play with me? You haven't even seen the best game yet. I was gonna show it to you tonight. Now I'm not going to. Ever. You'll never get to play it." "What is wrong with you?" I was seriously getting worried. "Is something the matter? I promise I'll play with you tomorrow. I have a lot of work to do tonight, that's all." Leo started to cry. His face was red with rage. When we arrived home, he said nothing. He just stormed inside and hurried into the living room, slamming the door behind him. I ran after my son, wondering what on earth had gotten into him, but the more I tried to calm him down, the more he screamed at me. "I'm never letting you play the Sega Genesis again," he bellowed. "It's mine anyway, get out!" I could not condone this behavior, however out of character it was for Leo. I took my son by the arm and walked him to his room. "I don't know what's gotten into you," I said firmly, "but you are not playing any video game until you sort out your attitude. Stay in your room, I'll come and talk to you once you've calmed down." I stood outside the door, confused and concerned. I could hear my son having a fit of rage inside. I didn't know what to do. Should I call a doctor? No, that's silly, but what was going on? Leo did not try to leave his room. He just kept screaming, "I want to play, let me play." I heard him shout the name of a game I was unfamiliar with. At the time, I dismissed this minor detail. I was too concerned about my son's breakdown. If only I had noticed the game's title in my head there and then. If only I had investigated sooner. Finally, the screaming stopped. Leo sobbed a little and then went silent. I opened the door to find him sprawled out on his bed, fast asleep. Maybe he was just exhausted, I thought. I made Leo a sandwich and took it to his room, but he didn't wake up for the rest of the night. He was breathing heavily, as though he was extremely tired. It was 8 p.m. before I started my paperwork. Once it was finished, I then checked on my son a final time before going to bed. I was woken up early the next morning by the sound of merry music and beeping. Leo was playing the Genesis again. I walked into the living room and opened the door. He was sitting there exactly the same as he was the other night, with the controller close by. The TV and the console were switched off, but Leo looked completely relaxed when I walked in, as though he was not bothered by me catching him this time around. "You're up early," I said, hoping Leo felt better this morning. He looked at me, then turned his head back to the TV screen without saying a word. "What have you been playing?" I asked him. Leo said nothing. He pulled the game out of the console and shoved it into the box, then got up and walked past me. I grabbed his wrist. "Hey, what's the matter? Why aren't you speaking? Are you feeling okay?" Leo looked at me for a few seconds, then said in a calm voice, "It's time to find the Bone King." "What, son?" I questioned. "Are you dreaming?" He said nothing else. I looked at the time. It was 5 a.m. Leo had been sleeping since around 7 the previous night. Leo never asked me to play on the Genesis with him that afternoon, nor the afternoons afterwards. He did not even mention the console. Leo's gloomy personality had returned, but he still played the Genesis quietly by himself every afternoon. Sometimes I would walk in and see him playing Road Rash and ask to join, but he would ignore me. Other times, usually at night, he would play with the living room door closed. He would then quickly and silently turn off the console and the TV before I walked into the room. I tried to have conversations with my son, and he would look at me solemnly, occasionally saying something bizarre. If I took the console off him, he would scream and curse at me. Once he calmed down, I would let him play again until one day I decided that enough was enough. When Leo came home from school that afternoon, I said to him, "Go get changed. We're going to play football." He looked at me with a scowl as though he was disgusted with the idea. I ignored this. "I've even bought you a new ball. Come on, let's go." I knew Leo wouldn't follow, so I took his arm gently and led him to the door, and then he snapped. "No, I need to get through the dungeon. Dad, I have to. The Bone King is coming. I have to beat him or everyone will die. He won't stop." "Leo, you can play your computer game later. You need some exercise," I said, as calmly as I could. He was furious. His eyes were wide and threatening. "No!" Then he started screaming and kicking and struggling with all of his might. "He's got my skin," he shouted. "He's burning me. Help! Help! "What on earth are you talking about?" I asked. "The Bone King is burning me. I'm going to die." "I've had enough," I said to Leo exhaustedly. "Go to bed." He continued to kick and scream, so I took my son to his room. He then fell to his knees and actually sobbed. I could hear Leo having a mental breakdown on the other side of the door. I felt powerless and wondered what on earth I was supposed to do. What had become of my son? What would his mother have done in this situation? I should have called a therapist or something, but I had no money. All I could do was keep that console as far away from Leo as possible, and if circumstances came to the worst, get rid of it altogether. I struggled to listen to Leo's wailing. "I'm trapped. I can't get to him. He's outside. He's waiting for me. He's after my bones. Help. I can't fight." It was too much. I couldn't stand there any longer. It sounded as though my son was in physical pain. My instincts as a parent took over and I opened the door. I just wanted to run to him, to hold him and tell him everything was okay, that it was all in his head. The moment I opened the door, Leo darted at me. It was the fastest I'd ever seen him move. His face was red and fierce, and he looked upon me hatefully, his eyes streaming with tears. When he reached me, he raised his small arm high in the air and struck me, right across the face. The blow caught my left eye and nose. It hurt, not immensely, but you never would have guessed it had come from a 7-year-old child. I held my face in pain and shock as Leo ran past me over to the living room. I heard a thud as he crashed into the wall, not just once but twice. I turned and saw him attacking thin air, jumping and kicking, screaming the whole time. "I can't kill him, I need a weapon." I panicked. Was he talking about me? Leo entered the living room, attacking everything in his path. He punched straight into a glass vase, causing it to shatter and his hand to stream with blood. He cried out in pain before lifting the small table beneath it and throwing it across the room, smashing the window. I wanted to get to the phone, but the second he saw me glance upon it, he destroyed that as well. I ran over to my son. Leo, calm down," I said hopelessly. "Get away from me," he shouted and picked up a huge shard of glass. Its edges cut deep into his hand, but he ignored it. Leo froze and we locked eyes. "Please, son, I'll help you. Just please calm down. None of this is real. It's all in your head. Please stop." He held the glass shard out in front of him and pointed it towards me. "You aren't getting these bones. These bones belong to the prince. I shall protect them." I was terrified. I had to stop Leo, but he was so dangerous right now. Then I thought of something incredibly risky. I darted to the right of the room where the Sega Genesis lay near the TV. My son then did something terrifying. He dropped both his arms, opened his mouth wide, and let out a long cry in a deep voice which was definitely not his own. I turned on both the TV and console, then quickly looked through the games. They all seemed normal apart from one, which had a pure black label with nothing but a small image at the bottom. It was a tiny bone, scorched red, with a small flame coming off one end. It had no title and no Sega logo. "This must be it," I whispered to myself. I then inserted the cartridge into the Sega Genesis. At once, Leo stopped making the dreadful noise. He dropped the glass shard on the floor and fixated his eyes upon the TV screen. The blank TV screen. He walked over slowly and calmly. I stepped aside to allow my son to reach his game console. He lifted the controller, took a small breath of relief, then pressed the start button. Leo gazed at the screen for a few seconds before pressing the directional pad followed by other buttons. I watched him in silence as he relaxed and used the controller as if he were playing a game, but the screen was black and empty. It appeared as though the console and the TV were both switched off. I looked around the room, there were bloodstains on the floor, and the little furniture we had was either damaged or completely destroyed. After a few minutes, I turned back to my son, who was moving his head around as though he was watching something. "What are you doing?" I asked him, unsure of what else to say or do. Leo looked up at me with a huge grin upon his face and said in a cheerful tone, "I'm playing Bone Hunter, Dad. Do you want to join in?" That was Bone Hunter. Final thoughts? Very unique. The first thing I have to say is that the decision whether or not to have this on the show was quite difficult. I was having a hard time figuring out if this would even be considered a video game creepypasta or not, since it's more focused on the child doing something weird rather than a video game. In fact, the game Bone Hunter doesn't even exist. Eventually, I decided that I'd record this story for a nice change of pace, but I'd really like to keep the focus on creepypasta about real video games. That being said, I'll get onto what I think of the story. I thought that the story was pretty interesting and that the father was written pretty realistically. It's a nice change of pace for many stories where people don't act very human. Well, the child doesn't act normal, but of course that's the point of the story. I do like that the story is left somewhat open to interpretation, as you could come up with theories about exactly what Bone Hunter has done and what it is, but without just throwing up everything into the air and telling you to figure it out. That being said, a lot of the ending goes from creepy to an action scene from a horror movie. It can be tense, but you aren't really creeped out. Also, it's confusing as to why the story stops where it does. From a storytelling perspective, I can understand that it ends there to leave things open-ended and be creepy, but it doesn't make sense from in a story perspective. The story is told from the father's first-person perspective, so it's confusing as to why the story would end there unless it's implied that we're hearing his train of thought leading up to his death, in which case it wouldn't make sense why he uses past tense. Also, we don't know if he died or not, but it seems to imply that he's unharmed at the moment since his son has calmed down by then. I think overall it's a well-written story, but it might leave a bit too much open-ended. That's it for this week's Creepypasta. Tune in again next week when we tackle yet another video game creepypasta. If you want to write your own story, help peer edit a story, or even just read the stories early, check out the description where you'll find a link to the Creepypasta section of my forum. You'll also find a link to the playlist of every creepypasta reading I've done. Remember that if you want your stories to be read on the show, you must stay active on your post on the forum as well as read the forum rules. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, sweet dreams.